Thank you for joining us today. We've got James Folkes-Comninellis from the Office of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs. So thank you, James, for taking some time to talk with us today.
Yeah, glad to do it. Glad to be here.
Tell me about what is the Office of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs?
So our office has been in the St. Louis Archdiocese since Vatican II, so since the 1960s. So we've been here 30 years. And what we do is sort of divided into two areas, which is indicated by the name. Ecumenical, it comes from a Greek word, oikos, which means the house. So it's the people of the house, right? So it can really refer to anyone who might be in our community. But for our purposes in the Catholic world, ecumenical tends to mean inter-Christian, whereas interreligious means communication or exchange with peoples of non-Christian traditions. That doesn't have to be faith traditions. Generally, it does need to be a community that is organized, and there are some organized atheist communities that we do work with, but those communities don't necessarily have to identify as faith-based or religious for us to be in dialogue with them.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about that perspective, but of course, that does make a lot of sense. Yeah.
So in those two areas have very different methods. For Christians, we share baptism. We share, for Christians of many traditions, we all generally share baptism. We share same Trinitarian perspective. There are some traditions who are called non-Trinitarian Christianity. Generally, we wouldn't include those communities under ecumenical. We would say communities that share baptism, some understanding of Eucharist, even if it's not identical with ours, and an understanding of the Trinity. Those are all included under ecumenical work. So in those communities, we already have a lot that we can start with. We can start by talking about our shared scripture, our shared baptism. We can we have differences over things like what the Eucharist means, particularly a conflict that comes up is the difference of how we understand faith and works and merit and what that means in the plan of salvation. But that's still starting from a very common base, whereas on the interreligious side, we do a lot of educational work, like this community uses this scripture, and in this community, scripture means A, B, or C, because scripture doesn't mean the same thing in every community. Some scriptures are much more fluid than our scripture, which is very sort of rigid and canonical. So on the interfaith side, we do a lot of education work, and on the ecumenical side, we generally are doing a lot of community building work, just knowing each other. As well as we tend to work on issues together in the inter-Christian world, like things like religious freedom, working against the sin of racism, things like that. Those things, because our communities match up very nicely, it's very easy to already start working on those issues together.
And the education side of things and the interfaith work, interreligious work, the education is more for Catholics then as well, or?
So not necessarily, no. Our audience is first our Catholic community, definitely. We want to form our Catholic community around Catholic teaching. But when we make an invitation to visit a place of worship that is not Catholic or Catholic, that invitation will go out to our whole network. And so we might be arranging a visit, for example, which we did this past fall, arranged a visit to a mosque, or in this case, it was a Bosnian community. And many of the people who were there were Catholic. We had some religious sisters. We had some Catholic high school students who came. But it is not closed to anyone else. Anyone can come, and anyone can learn about those communities by coming to events or using some of our online resources as well.
That's really cool. And I imagine that part of the impetus for that, I mean, besides, Vatican II really did put a lot of emphasis on dialogue, it's also that there's kind of institutional heft in the Catholic Church in St. Louis, so it has the draw that maybe other smaller organizations might not be able to have such a wide network to reach out to as well.
Yeah, I mean, we are, the Catholic Church in St. Louis is, we're a big train, and that has good things and bad things. We have a lot of movement in the community, which is great, but it's also like when we try and get everyone on the same page, it's a lot harder because we're just a lot bigger. And when we talk about our diocese, we're talking about rural communities that really don't have as much diversity as, say, the urban parts of our community. And how we work with those communities is going to be different. So in rural areas of the diocese, we may be talking more about inter-Christian work, whereas in more urban settings, we might be talking about interfaith work a little bit more intentionally, or interreligious work.
Got it. And how did you personally become involved in this work?
It depends on how far back you want to go. I did not grow up Catholic, and I became Catholic as an adult. That was quite a journey. If you want the long version of that, I can give you. The short version is, while I was in my master's in religious education at St. Louis University, I was invited by the Archdiocese, because of my background in different religious communities. I was invited to do an internship with the Archdiocese. And what I did for that internship is I essentially took all of our resources around dialogue and I translated them into a social media digital space. And that was sort of my project. After I finished that project, it's about a year, they invited me to come on as staff. So I am, at this point, I'm the only full-time staff working in our ecumenical office. But I will say, compared to many dioceses in our region, it's pretty rare to have an ecumenical office, let alone have a full-time staffer. I know Archdiocese of Chicago has a few staffers, but other than that, I don't know of any other diocese in our region that has as robust a staff as St. Louis has. So it's a real blessing for our city.
Great. So what are some more memorable moments that have happened in your work at the time you've been there?
Let's see, some memorable things. Working with the Coptic community. So the Coptic Orthodox Christian community its origin is in Egypt, and they do have one parish, Saints Mary and Ibrahim, which I believe, if memory serves, is in North County. And so there have been several questions come into our office from our Catholic community about what Christian communities are being persecuted and what should we know about them. And the experts on that at this point are the Egyptians, especially during sort of ISIS and their heyday. There were several Libyan martyrs. I can't remember the exact number, but around the year anniversary of the Libyan martyrs, we did an event with Saints Mary and Ibrahim Coptic Orthodox Church and with St. Monica's Church in Creve Coeur, where we basically invited the two communities to come together and hear from their pastor, whose name is escaping me right now, but and he basically talked about what the Egyptian Christian community looks like here in the United States, what it looks like in Egypt, and he talked about especially the Libyan martyrs and sort of what they went through and sort of these modern martyrs of Christianity. That was a very powerful event, and working with a Christian community like that really is powerful because even some of the language that they use starts tearing down our preconceived notions. So when they talk about God, they talk about Allah, because in their native tongue, that's God. So they use similar greetings to other communities. So they'll say, peace of God be with you. And it sounds a lot like some of your greetings in the Muslim communities. And you realize that some of these barriers that have been built up are cultural barriers rather than religious barriers. So that's a major ecumenical event it was definitely not our largest event. In fact, it was one of our smaller events. But just getting a Coptic community and a Catholic community together speaking to one another is really powerful. And I really appreciate that. So we have a regular program called Meeting Our Neighbors, which when I referred to the visit we did to the mosque, that is part of that program, where 4 or 5 times a year we will visit the worship space of another faith tradition, and we'll learn about their tradition from a representative from that tradition. And that's really the key methodology that we use in this office, where if you went to university and you studied in a world religions class, you'd have one professor talking about all the different religions. Or if you went to a religions class in high school, unless it was a really good one, you would mostly have one teacher talking about all the religions. Whereas, as far as possible, we try to not speak for faith communities, but let them speak for themselves through official representatives. And we do that through an interfaith partnership of St. Louis. There is an official organization, and all of our interfaith work is vetted and worked through that organization. It's really a wonderful group of people. But in any case, so that program, the Meeting Our Neighbors program, brings people into the religious space of someone else. And it immediately sets you up because you are in their aesthetic. You are in their space. You are in, a place of wisdom in their tradition, a place of quiet, a place of meditation usually. And it immediately puts you in a different frame of mind, because you are not just hearing about a person on the news or hearing about a community from someone else, but you are in their aesthetic. Not just hearing, but you're seeing, you're feeling, you're smelling in some cases. So that can, as part of that Meeting Our Neighbors program, we have visited Hindu communities, we have visited Buddhist communities, we have visited Muslim communities, we have visited Jewish communities as well. We had planned more visits this year, but COVID sort of locked everything down. We're hoping that, depending on how the future goes, we may continue those visits in a virtual way through something like this, something like Zoom with questions and answers and things like that. But we'll see. We're all sort of adapting with the recent changes. I would say of those different visits to places of worship, one of the most striking for me has been the visit to the Hindu temple of St. Louis, which is on Weidman Road in sort of southwest St. Louis. It's a beautiful structure. It's very small for a Hindu temple, but you basically you drive onto this campus, not an excessively large campus, but you drive onto a campus and suddenly you're sort of transported to the south of India, because it's a beautiful structure with the sort of dome that they have on in that area of the world. It's called a Rajagopuram. And it's full of sculptures of different representations of God. And that community is striking to me because of, so our tour guide for that is a man named Jack Sisk. And if you go onto our website, we have a collection of videos about different faith traditions. And Jack is the one who's done all our videos on Hinduism. He grew up as a Presbyterian and became a Hindu as an adult. And so he's able to really talk across religious understandings about his faith tradition. He leads our tours, and he sort of explains the aesthetic, but you're in this beautiful space with lots of iconography. And that's really what is powerful to me, because not only is there a lot of iconography around, but there's a lot of chanting and there's a lot of children. And for me, that's like home. I'm a Byzantine Catholic by background. So in my space, there's a lot of icons and there's a lot of children and there's a lot of chanting. So obviously they're chanting in Sanskrit, so it's not exactly the same. At my parish, which is the St. Louis Byzantine Catholic Mission, we chant in English for the most part. Every now and again, we will do some Slavonic chant, but mostly we are chanting in English. But the way they interact with their icons, the way that they venerate the icons, the way that they chant through their services, and the way the children just sort of run wild, it's very much like home. And it's, I really think there's a writer. He does interreligious dialogue. He's a Jesuit professor. His name is Francis Clooney, and he's written several books on Hindu Catholic dialogue. Which I highly recommend. I read them as part of my formation during my graduate studies. And he has this, I'm going to paraphrase, but he basically says, you have entered dialogue when you can feel drawn by another tradition. There's still separation. It's not like you feel one with the tradition. We agree to be different from other traditions. Absolutely. And there's no question that we agree that the Catholic Church and that Jesus Christ is the fullness of truth and the fullness of salvation. But that being said, we can see the truths of God in other traditions. We can see them shine through, and we can see their beauty. And I have had moments where I am talking to a person of the Hindu faith especially, and they're sharing some of the wisdom of their tradition, which is very old. It's a very old tradition, and it's beautiful. It really is beautiful the way that they believe God has these many forms in order to appeal to many cultures and to many persons in different places of life. I mean, one of the biggest misconceptions about Hinduism that I learned is that Hinduism is monotheistic. That we tend to think of it as a polytheistic religion because of their iconography. But that's akin to someone going into a Catholic church and seeing the statues and the icons and saying this is polytheism or idolatry or something like that. No, in their case, they believe there is one God, but he has many forms, basically. And they believe in the fullness. They believe their God cannot be confined to one form. They do have names for God as a formless being, disassociated from gender and form and things like that. But you can't make iconography out of that. So I find that tradition especially because there is so much of a dichotomy made between East and West, between Christianity and Eastern religions. But if at least you're talking about Eastern Christianity, that kind of toes the line between East and West. But there is a lot there that can be dialogued about.
Well, and in the present day, it's not only the philosophies, but we're all facing similar struggles. I've been hearing from your partner organizations about how they're dealing with pandemic time.
Yeah. So we're all dealing with that. And with the pandemic and with sort of adapting to a new way of life and dealing with the vulnerable populations in our community, these are all issues that are very important. And so one thing that the Interfaith Partnership of St. Louis has done for the last month, I don't know if it's going to continue. I guess it'll depend on sort of how things roll out. But what they've done for the last month is that every Thursday they have arranged a virtual prayer together. So it's what we, I can't remember the term, but basically there are a couple of different ways to do interfaith prayer, and the way that they do is certainly the way that our office would support, where it's one person's tradition presenting a prayer in that tradition, and then a person following that tradition. So it's they're taking turns praying, basically. There is a type of prayer called unitive prayer or syncretic prayer, where you sort of pray to the God of all knowledge and things like that. That's a type of prayer we don't generally do. In my experience, we have not done prayer like that. Yeah. We try and keep prayer in the tradition of the prayer, and sort of pray next to each other, but not necessarily blur the differences between each other.
That makes sense.
We've had these virtual prayer circles, is what they've been called. We basically had 4 representatives who would offer a prayer in their tradition. So some of those prayers have been chanted, some of them have been said. I did one prayer doing Byzantine chant. I'm a cantor in my community, so that's always fun to present that sort of prayer. And then we had Sister Mary Kathleen Ronan, who is on our Ecumenical and Interreligious Commission. That's sort of like our board of advisors, for want of a better term. She also presented a prayer as part of one of these circles. And during my circle, we had a prayer from Sikh, from the Sikh community, which is a monotheistic religion originating in the Middle East. We had a prayer from an Eastern Catholic, and I believe Jewish, and then a Protestant prayer. I can't remember which tradition, but to have the same people together, meeting together on the grounds of prayer, and saying we are seeking God together in this difficult time where we're all trapped indoors and we're lacking community, is really a beautiful testament to how the interfaith world in St. Louis is able to work together. And it's a real privilege to be able to be in that space.
Sure. So how can folks from College Church get plugged into your work?
So we sort of do there's probably 2 major ways we could plug into that work. We do have a number of presentations that we have done for parishes, for theologies on tap, for different schools, and those topics will range from Catholic teaching on ecumenism and interreligious engagement. So that's us talking about a lot of Vatican II teaching and its application in our office regularly. And then we've done presentations on Catholic-Muslim relations, Catholic-Jewish relations. So that would be one way. So inviting us to give a presentation virtually or otherwise in your parish, that's one way to get involved. We have a number of events throughout the year. In January, we have the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, which is really amazing. I'll just list off some of the Christian communities who come together in prayer at that time. So we have the Missionary Baptist community comes, which is a largely African-American Baptist tradition. We'll have the Southern Baptists come sometimes. We'll have Presbyterian. We will have Armenian Orthodox. They are regular participants in the service. We'll have Catholics, Eastern Catholics. We'll have some evangelicals as well. We have a great connection with one of our staff members here who is a charismatic Catholic who is also very connected with the sort of charismatic side of evangelical Christianity, and she's a beautiful asset to this office. So all of those communities will come together, and if you can get an Armenian Orthodox and a Baptist in the same room praying together for the same purpose, I mean, that's really beautiful. And then the other major interfaith program we do is the Meeting Our Neighbors program. So again, we don't have any visits scheduled at this time. We had a visit scheduled to a small We have 20 Buddhist temples in St. Louis.
Oh, wow.
You wouldn't know it, but
No.
there are 20 of them centered around the Webster Groves area in St. Louis. They tend to be very small communities, but there are as many synagogues and mosques as there are Buddhist temples in St. Louis. So, and there's a richness of tradition there. So there's several different Buddhist denominations or Buddhist traditions represented here in St. Louis. So we had arranged a visit to the Japanese Buddhist community. There is some hope that we can arrange that again via distance. So that would be another way. Whether we begin those in person or do them by distance, we would like to continue doing those. So those I'd say were the major ways. And then also just using us as a resource. If you have questions about the interfaith community, about wanting to connect on a certain topic that deals with interreligious or interchristian engagement, we get lots of good questions about that. We've gotten calls from ex-Catholics who are curious what Catholic teaching is around X, Y, or Z. We have gotten questions from parishes about tension with local communities, or how to navigate good hospitality, and we've sort of been consultant on those. So if there's a desire for particular committees or the parish at large to connect with certain communities, we can help be a bridge between those communities.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure to have links on this interview so that we have a place for folks to go to. James, this has been really wonderful. Thanks for your time today.
Yep, glad to do it.